Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Social Justice and the City program here at the Issam Faris Institute at the American University of Beirut, I am proud and extremely pleased to welcome you all for a debate that we've been plotting and thinking about and imagining for a couple of months now. Many of you here know me as a Beirut Madinati person. I am here in my capacity as the director of a research program based here in the Issam Faris Institute, which is called Social Justice and the City. Our program is unique in the center in the sense that we seek to influence public policy, like all other programs, in a way that works through and with non-governmental organizations and activist groups who are trying to make a difference. So unlike other policymakers who attempt to work directly with public policymakers and elected politicians, we have decided that to put our efforts to create partnerships and work in collaboration with other non-governmental groups, activist groups, people who really hope to change the world from the bottom up and advocate it. And so tonight's event is really done in collaboration with Beirut Madinati, which I think many of you know, began about a year and a half ago as a group of activists who got together and decided to mount a campaign to take over the municipality of Beirut. Over that year, the campaign rallied many, many activists from different walks of life. I should say that one of the big inspirations to some of the people who started it, and that definitely includes me and others like Jad Shaban, who's not here, and Nayla, were the movements that were happening in Europe. We were hearing about what was the change in Spain. We were hearing about Syriza in Greece. We were getting inspired, and we really felt very much in conversation that issues that had to do with the city could actually produce the fuel for change. Eventually, with many of you who became friends and are in the room here, and I'm very pleased to welcome you, Beirut Madinati scored quite high in local elections, but in the absence of a proportional law, did not make it into government. And over the last year, it's been a struggle to transform what started like a campaign into a real political platform. So in the last 3 days, we've been really lucky to run conversations and workshops within Beirut Madinati with Isidro Lopez, who is an elected parliamentarian for the Madrid area in Spain on behalf of Podemos, but also a sociologist who's worked in research centers, invested in imagining and working towards a more inclusive and sustainable way, wrote as a scholar on these topics for many years before he decided to become a full-time politician. In conversation with him, we're very honored to have one of the founding members of Beirut Madinati, Nayla Geagea. I think many of you know her. Nayla is a lawyer and a researcher. She has more than 10 years of experience working on issues related to human rights, social justice, the social protection of vulnerable groups, international crime, and more. Since 2009, she's also engaged in legal research and drafted legal briefs and other documents that have been quite influential. I will not say more about both of them. Their bios are available online on our program's website and on the Issam Faris Institute, because I know all of you are here to hear them and not me. So please join me in welcoming Isidro Lopez and Nayla Geagea.
Good evening, everyone. First, thank you, Mana, for this very eloquent and gratifying introduction, and of course for organizing this very special event. Thank you, Isidro, for being among us today. We're all looking forward to hear about your very enlightening experience over the past years. And last but not least, of course, a big, big thank you to our audience this evening. We truly hope you will enjoy the talk and the discussion. I had the opportunity to take part in a couple of workshops led by Isidro here in Beirut during the last weekend. And believe me, 2 hours are not enough to go over even half of what Isidro has to say and to share. This is why I suggest the following. During the first hour, I will be asking Isidro to speak about 3 different chapters through a series of questions. We're going to start with the history and context, then we're going to move to Podemos' evolution and political path, and we're going to end with lessons learned and a hint of personal experience. Then we will open the floor to your questions, thoughts, and comments. And please don't hesitate to take notes. We really want to make the session as much interactive as possible. So we're going to start with the first question. Before we go into the current state of the Spanish politics and Podemos' role and impact, it would be probably useful to revisit the recent political history and context, since the beginning of the transition phase in the 70s until the financial crisis broke in 2008. Isidro, in your opinion, what were the main events that deeply influenced the Spanish society on the financial, social, economical levels, and eventually led to the emergence of these new alternative political groups?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me for this wonderful 3 years of work together with Beirut Madinati. And then, going to the question. First of all, I have to say that even though, just to make clear, even though it's clear that now I am an MP for Podemos, I want to restate it again. In my, all along my life as a researcher and a sort of a political activist, I've been doing both things. But let's say that my standpoint today is that of a political person. So just to be clear where I am talking from, I won't fake any kind of neutrality. So
we're happy.
Just to clear it out, because sometimes, the discourse can be in between, of course, research and social research and politics. So this is politics. All right. So going back to the question, without making too long an introduction, it has to be kept in mind that the outcome of what we call the transition in Spain, that is the years that go between the death of General Franco and depending on who's telling the story, between the death of General Franco and the settle in 1978 of the Spanish Constitution, or in other accounts, to the victory of the Socialist Party in 1982. But I say that period that stems from 8 years in which a new regime is set up in Spain, came out as a result with a bipartisan political system, with the Socialist Party and a conservative liberal party, which is the Popular Party, which alternated in power in a sort of a classic Turnism, classic bipartisan way, and held a certain sort of number of features that were stable and that which were part of a consensus between the two parties, and that unraveled in a sort of very acute way on the crisis of which started, the war crisis, which started in 2007, but that in Spain was felt in 2009, 2010. This was completely destroyed. So to give some features to give some just some schematic lines of what the regime was about, we have to go back to those transition years, which were years of struggles, years of a very acute, deep social conflict on at least two axes, that of the working class and that of the students, right? And this started well before the fall of the Franco regime, and until the end of the 70s, there is like something like an internal, not conflict, but there are these two poles in the resistance to Francoism, which compete among themselves who is going to be the leading one in leading the transition. And there is a third pole, which we can call the Francoist reformism, let's say the phases of the internal solution of the Francoist regime in order to get power. Those are the three forces in play at the transition, which roughly in the terms of the student movement and the workers' conflict, coincide with or are equal to the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. And the Socialist Party keeps growing all over these years when it wasn't the main bulk of the resistance to the Franco regime was led by the Communist Party. The main bulk of social conflict within the Franco years was led by the Comisiones Obreras, which are the trade union of the Communist Party. But at some point, the Socialist Party keeps the lead, and insofar as it represents an emerging middle class, let's say, that wins the battle over the Communist Party, which gets relegated to a third-party position in percentage from 15 to ranging from 10 to 15% in the vote, always stays there, but it's no longer, let's say, a governmental option. So there is this new middle class that all over these years wins the battle over the working classes, and that gives, let's say, a regime like two main axes of support. That is the Conservative and the Socialist Party, which is, as I said, something stemming out of a new class forming out in Spain, right? This class was actually formed, of course, by, a Spanish educational system has always been quite, there's always been a fair degree of university degrees, a fair degree of high students, and that was the bulk of this new class to rise. And there was a very important factor in order to create this stability. Let's say, the refusal to the revolutionary ideas that the working classes were holding during the transition, and it's the idea of Europe. Europe being social, in the minds of the Spaniards, being in the minds of these middle Spanish classes, being rights, being social democracy, being public expense, being welfare state, being, bridging the historical gap between the semi-periphery and the core countries, right? And of course, the victory of the Socialist Party in 1982 was seen as the main step towards getting to Europe, insofar as it broke loose from the Francoist heritage. But as it usually happens in the semi-periphery, the cycles overlap when the Spanish middle classes were asking for more welfare state, for more rights, for more social democracy in the form of the Socialist Party. Neoliberalism was rising in the core countries. So we had this sort of strange overlapping of phases, which meant that even if there was a fair expansion of the welfare state, basically healthcare and education systems, at the very same moment, Europe started imposing neoliberal policies to the Socialist Party. So, for example, the whole deindustrialization of the country was done during those years with a fair degree of conflict, but the legitimacy of the Socialist Party coming from the left was so high that demobilization of those working class sectors was possible. You know, the right could have never done that, right? So once this first set of obstacles were overcome, Spain gained accession to the EU, and then a particular, I wouldn't say vernacular phenomenon, but quite idiosyncratic in its development, even though it is such as capitalism has shaped in the 80s and in the 90s. It was at the forefront of capitalism in those years, was developing in Spain, which is the real estate bubble. Enormous real estate bubbles, two of them. One from 1986 to 1992, and the other one from 1995 to 2007. Enormous. Possibly Spain is, in what regards financial and real estate bubbles, is possibly the biggest laboratory on earth. You know, wages were declining, public expenses were declining, but house prices were rising very, very, very fast, and credit was spreading very, 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 very fast, and that created like the material basis for these sort of big middle classes to prosper in those years. You know, insofar as credit was flowing, particularly in the second bubble, the situation was controlled, right? Even if real wages from the 70s onwards have done by declining or stagnating, depending on the periods, but never rising. You know, several labor market reforms were held during those years, in which the price of all the costs associated with labor were slashed, completely slashed. The cost of firing, cost of hiring, also all those let's say. Rights linked to the labor market were completely destroyed. And at some point, just before the bubble exploded, Spain had by far the biggest percentage of temporary workers in the whole European Union, which amounted to 38% of the labor force. This meant that insofar as the internal engine of the Spanish economy was house prices, credit, those sort of linked to internal demand, and expanded the Spanish economy in far bigger levels than the rest of the European countries for a long while, until this came to an end. Insofar as the labor market was so fragile and so dependent on demand, wealth effects, the economists call it, you know, demand based on the prices of housing and on credit, that unemployment just completely broke loose in the space of 6-7 months. You know, from 38% temporary workers and a rate of unemployment of around 10%, 7, 8, 9%.
This is 2008, right?
We're talking 2009. Completely exploded in several months. And in 2010, the percentage had inverted, you know, 15-14% temporary workers, and all the rest of this temporary labor force had gone to unemployment. You know, unemployment figures were completely massive. And this, of course, had an intersection which is quite important, not only for economical reasons, but also for the, let's say, the slashing of the ideals of the rising middle classes, which were no longer rising, but were established middle classes that have been, you know, like the core of the system for 40 years almost, in the form of European austerity policies, right? I won't go into the European financial crisis, but Spain, insofar as unemployment was rising, public expenditure was rising, financial crisis was on the loose. You know, financial institutions were completely full of real estate assets that didn't have a price at that moment, didn't even have a price. It's not that they were reduced, and no one didn't know how to calculate how much they were worth. So it was a completely enormous sort of financial and social crisis of the state, very fast indebted, and that sort of triggered all sorts of excessive deficit protocols from the part of the European Union, and this meant cuts, and this meant privatizations in a huge scale during those years. That was, for peculiarities of the Spanish model, you know, for those of you who don't know, Spain has got 17 autonomous communities. And these autonomous communities government, they've got the competences in things such as healthcare, education, social services, and many others. And those cuts and privatizations were passed on to autonomous governments. And in the last analysis, if you see, we had like the middle strata and the poorer strata of society just hit in three fronts. The wage labor market front, in which unemployment was rising, the debt levels, that massive indebtedness from the years of the bubble will create in terms of mortgages that couldn't be repaid, and on the third axis of striking, like the social majorities, we had the public in retreat. So this gave sort of we call it if economists or political economists talk about wealth effects, we call at that moment that the poverty effect. You know, like declining levels of welfare or welfare levels were so acute that the whole social structure was collapsing. You know, and this is like the material setting and the political setting, because from 2010 to 2011, we had an economical crisis, but we didn't have a political crisis. Political crisis started in 15M.
And this is where we're going to continue. So, as you mentioned during our previous discussions, and if you go back to the title of our talk today, From 15 May to Institutions, one can fairly assume that Podemos and the other political groups was not actually the first political new actor on the Spanish scene. And more importantly, we would stress that 15 May, along with the other groups, were not only active back then around electoral issues or political, really going directly into the political battle, but more or less you were working around social, economical crisis and very fundamental problems within society. And in fact, you mentioned that you yourself were a member in Ahora Madrid before you joined Podemos, right? And just Ahora Madrid is actually a political group that was formed in Madrid on the local level, and they ran for the municipal elections, and their experience is very similar to Beirut Madinati's experience. So we can say that there were antecedents to Podemos, and we can also say that Podemos members were, and some of them maybe are still active in other political groups. So it would be really interesting for us, to walk us through this phase when Podemos was actually established as a new independent political party. How did it happen? What were the circumstances? What were the main challenges? And, over the time of, we can talk 3 years, between 2011 and 2014.
So let's say that, for the Spanish political regime, which for 40 years had been pretty stable, had been pretty much in control, 15M is like an earthquake. It's like an earthquake. It's like the first step for a wholly new political ecosystem. There, of course, there is Podemos as a main known force, but it is the ecosystem that 15M open, in which these political forms thrive, right? In which these political forms live and feed, and they all come from a common branch, from a common language, from a common stance, which is 15M, to different degrees.
Common concerns, right?
Yeah, to different degrees, right? And different readings of 15M and different relations with 15M. But at the end of the day, it's like the originating event, you know.
Just briefly describe what happened, what is 15M?
Yeah. 15M was a fairly, not small, but quite sort of controlled 3,000 demonstrations, 15th of May 2011, in which there wasn't any sort of political parties behind, any sort of trade unions behind, any sort of organized political realities, such as they were or not prominent organized political realities, which were behind that demonstration, in which it was asked very few things. It was, we want real democracy now. We are not a merchandise in the hands of politicians and bankers. This is not a crisis, this is a scam. You know, like three basic, you know. The program was very, it's as vague as it is radical. And that's his strong point. So this demonstration finishes up, and some people want to occupy, in following the example of Tahrir and, you know, the Arab Spring events, they want to occupy the Puerta del Sol. They are expelled from, the police forces expel them. They go back the next day. So at some point, this sort of strange, magical events that happens once in a while, people start flocking to the Puerta del Sol in order to support those people that have resisted there or have decided to occupy. A camp is set up, like a camp that will last for months. I think in Tahrir there was also a camp, I believe. So very much in the same way, a city within the city is something very, and people come by multitudes. There were local elections to be held afterwards, local and regional elections, and at some point it was, well, the Spanish law says that it is forbidden to have political demonstrations on what we call Reflection Day, which is the day before the elections. And this was massively disobeyed. Massively. And I'm talking about possibly 200,000 people in the plaza and all the alleys completely packed with people that were disobeying this. Of course, we're not talking activists here. Activists were in here, of course, but we're talking something rather large. My mother was there. My mother's neighbor was there. You know, like almost everyone, which are not activists, by the way. It's just as you get a sense of how how penetrating this was as a political stance, and this also leads to distinction that has to be held in mind, and it's the distinction between the social movements and the movement. Here we're talking about a movement in the good old masses sense, whereas social movements, it's something which concerns us activists. You know, springs from the 80s, from the defeat of the 68 revolutionary movements, feminism, ecologism, pacifism, well, you know that, but this is no massive, no, it's rather on the contrary, it's a resistance strategy in a moment when the battle is almost lost. Let's just save some spaces, let's just find some spaces on freedom here and then, let's stop this and that policy. Here we're talking a movement in the sense of, la multitude, dans l'histoire, when there is a break of, this was 15M. It was a very, very sort of strong rejection of anything instituted, of anything representative.
The system?
Of anything that could. It was a moment of, I don't know how to explain it without sounding too vague, but a moment of recognition, right? We've been quiet for one of the slogans was, we were asleep, now we are awake. For many years, this sense of the political, of common deliberation, of seeing each other and talking about common problems was completely out of the question, except for us activists.
It was reclaiming.
It was total occupation of public space and public debate, both in a material and a metaphorical sense. So the result were endless assemblies, where people cried when they started talking because they have been suffering so much along the crisis. I never thought of the opportunity of talking in common. It was a bit like that sort of when in '68 there was this cult of the word, the cult of the speech. You go there, you speak to others. It was magnificent, but it wasn't exactly what we call political in a tactical or strategical sense. It was very expressive, and it was extremely important. Without that, we could never ever have gone anywhere. A foundational moment, right? So the occupation of the Puerta del Sol was held for quite a while, and afterwards, because after the occupation, we can talk of a 15M period that goes from 2011 and 2013. The Puerta del Sol was occupied at some point at the end of 2011, but let's say that there were following some episodes of social unrest which were completely influenced by 15M, even though it wasn't exactly the same scheme. One of them, very important one, is the platform against evictions, the PA, Plataforma de Afectados por la Hipoteca. Many of you will surely know Barcelona's mayor, Ada Colau. Well, she springs from that movement, right? This existed before 15M in a very sort of classic activist form, and very small form, but in the cross with 15M, it became very, very, very large movement. The crisis, the bubble, had left loads and loads of poor people indebted, maybe in the way of the subprime mortgages in the United States, but the Spanish law, the Spanish foreclosure law, is not the same as in the United States. In Spain, even once someone is evicted, they still keep the debt. It's a draconian law, because in the United States, you give the house, you become homeless, end of the story, right? In Spain, it's not like that. There is eviction, and then debt is retained forever. So when we talk about predatory loans on the poor, we do it in a very strong sense, much stronger than when we do it in the United States, right? So there was this movement, the Platform Against Evictions. What did was on a case-by-case basis avoid with physical but peaceful resistance, avoiding the eviction. And it grew so large as to question one sort of common point of financialized capitalism, which is that debts are an individual problem. What the platform against evictions at the end of the day did, and this is completely astonishing if you think about it, is to put on the menu, on the political menu, that debt is a collective problem, right? All these houses, all these mortgages were held by the same banks the state was rescuing with our money, with money from taxpayers. Of course, it was for many people, it was the moment that they became aware that something very unfair was going on here. You know, this was like a fuel to the, you know, the political crisis. Another movement that sprang from 15M, and it's vital in order to understand, because all these things, at the end of the day, when we go to Podemos, we'll see that many of the languages, many of the programmatic, let's say, strong points of Podemos are inherited.
From other groups?
Inherited from the foundational event, which is 15M. Another movement were the tides, la marée, en français, which were movements or struggles around public services, which were, at that moment, subject to cuts and privatizations, but they were peculiar in one way. They were not, for example, there was two main ones, the green tide and the white tide. The green tide was on education, and the white tide was on the healthcare system. And these weren't sectoral conflicts. I mean, these weren't trade union classic conflicts. There was a strike in the education, but this strike wasn't a teacher strike, but rather a movement that would involve the pupils and the parents, along with the teachers. Let's say the whole community behind the resource. Same thing for healthcare systems. Doctors were there, many doctors were there, but also non-sanitary personnel, patients, families of patients.
So it's similar to what happened in 2011, where there were not only activists or professionals, but also you had the whole community embracing these...
In a way, this is like, you know, some kind of shift from the discourse of the public to the discourse of the commons, you know, which is not exactly the same, even though they may share features. I mean, these resources are not the only property of the state, which can sell them at low price to private investors or to their friends.
Okay.
These are non-alienable, non-sellable assets which belong to the communities that use them. That was quite a strong statement. Just to finish on this point, just to tell you that until 2013, there were very, very, very large demonstrations held by the networks 15M had created, with no, let's say, political, previously organized institution actually behind them. But at some point, that system was it arrived to what we call the glass ceiling, you know, to touching something that was, because that's got to do with the next point, which is Podemos.
Yeah, I think maybe we took a bit of time here, and we need to manage it in order to open the floor for discussion, but it was important to set the context, because everyone talks and hears about Podemos, but I think, especially for the Lebanese context, it's extremely important to understand what was happening before things culminated and you had, you know, the Podemos experience. And maybe here you can start by also describing very briefly how Podemos was established, and maybe I will go more into details and into these very specific questions. Also in our, you know, discussions, you said it was really striking when you said that one of the first challenges that you faced after Podemos, and maybe you can link both events, the establishment deciding to run to elections, and then after these elections, you talked about the transition from being an electoral war machine, this is what you called it, to a political institution. We're talking here about in 2014, right? This after the European elections. And it's important, I think, for us, because we in Beirut Madinati are currently trying, to institutionalize and to organize ourselves in the same way. We started as an electoral machine, and now what we are trying to do is to organize ourselves within a political institution. And at the same time, also, if we go into these very specific questions, it will help channeling the discussion. It's maybe you can also talk or tackle the issue of the diverse political experience, because as you said now, Podemos is not something that was born out of nothing. You had many individuals who had extremely wide and complex experiences. So technically, these people also have very diverse political experience, and sometimes I would say that they might have, or they're even divided on some very crucial issues. So maybe it's also important to walk us through this phase, because I think it was a fundamental element to make sure that the transition from the electoral machine to this political institution was smooth. Maybe smooth is a very optimistic word, but.
I'll go to the beginnings of Podemos. And here I also have to make a disclaimer, and is my view on what Podemos is and its trajectory. It's wouldn't be shared by many people in the party, right?
They're not shared?
Not shared. This is a plural party, and we have, as we will talk before, there are several points of view. So I want to make this clear. This is no party line, right? It's an account. I mean, in this Podemos sphere, I stand on the critical sector. I got no problem with saying it, so that you know it. So it's not the only account possible of things. There are other accounts, right? But let's go back to that moment when all the mobilizations of 2015, they have arrived, like, what we called then the glass ceiling. And the glass ceiling was mainly a reflection that was saying, we are facing such an undemocratic state that in 2 years of mobilizations, we have gotten nothing.
So there was no concrete achievements?
We didn't have nothing. I mean, the platform against evictions had to stop a handful of evictions, which, of course, thank God for that. But in terms of actually shaping changes in actual policies, we got nothing, and we were facing a massive, let's say, offensive by both the European Union and the Spanish state, right? Which were, at the end of the day, are the same. It's like the same sort of this multi-level state, right? And so we had to go political. We needed a strategy, we needed tactics, we need to somehow enter the political established arena. And there, at that point, I wasn't in Podemos. People that were in Podemos, which were very few, I'm talking about 20 people, not
20 people around the table decided
more.
that.
There was this process was reflected from many different points. I mean, many different actors had this idea that we had to go into the institutions. Of course, some of us, we were more on the social movements, autonomous side of things. This was something like a taboo, like, oh my God, parliaments. What are we going to do? So, of course, it was.
Yeah, we don't want to go there.
Of course, we consider ourselves, and I still think there's a fair degree of politics which is done outside parliament. but this institutional, it was a bit like a sort of a personal crisis for me, like, no, parliaments, no, please.
You got over it, right?
Yeah, I got over it. Yeah, I'm there. But let's say that the difference these core Podemos people had in comparison to us is their experience in Latin America. Comparisons to Latin America can be tricky, very tricky in the Spanish context. They are once in a while from Latin American experience have grown into Spain. Some of them are wrong, and some of them are huge good points, such as the one which Podemos made. We were thinking in terms of, let's say, the boiling point of the social movements, right? Like, let's make this grow so much in the social that at some point the political becomes sort of soft, smooth, you know? Politics. It goes like, there's no trauma for us. It's just such a smooth way into the, all right, this has grown so much that there's no problem with this decision, right? Whereas what Podemos imported from Latin America was a different approach, and it is the political as a way of uncork or breaking the deadlock of the social, right? Mm-hmm. So by saying, we are going to the European elections, we are going to make a candidature. That broke completely this sort of impasse that we inherit from 15M, and the social situation became again loose. Mm-hmm.
Because of the achievement?
No, because just saying, we are going for
so by just stating that
we are going to make a candidature, we are running, we are doing it. We are doing it. We are not waiting anymore. We are doing it. So that very you
chose this because it was the nearest state. No, what was the tactic?
I wasn't there at the moment.
Didn't ask them? Why did you?
Yeah, but that's the experience in Latin America. It's much more straightforward. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's like there's no need for a justification for going for there are enough reasons. We don't have to build a case anymore. This is bad enough. It has been bad enough for 30 years. So what are we waiting for? You know. So
why are we looking for excuses?
Exactly. Well, what are we waiting for? If it's not now, then when? 10 years time, when? So it was a bold move, and it was a very good move. And the response to that were 5 elected seats in European Parliament, and this triggered just a huge
5 elected seats
in European Parliament. Out of many more, but no one would. I mean, this just created a sense of the possible. These people, out of nothing, Podemos is created. I mean, it's not created, but it goes to the light, the public light, in January 2014. Mm-hmm. By May 2014, got 5 seats in the European Parliament. It gives a sense of possibility. That, like, this is possible. So there was a huge sort of, we can call it like a second 15M, which is the constitution of the circles, right? All over the state, everywhere, start cropping up Podemos circles. Everywhere. There were 3,000 in very few weeks in support of this. Mm-hmm. Spontaneous, right? Circles were of 2 kinds mainly: territorial, my city, my neighborhood, my my autonomous community. Even the autonomous community is just a bit too large. Neighborhoods and small and medium cities are what territorial circles are about, and sectoral circles, lawyer circles, feminist circle. Economical experts go, you know. So you had there an organization in Nuche, you know, like something that was sort of growing wildly, and then of course the question. I've talked about the good points in Podemos. Now I'm going to talk about the bad. This was so vast the challenge for the core founders of Podemos that, being honest, they didn't know what to do with this. I mean, how you build up an organization in totally post, let's say, Communist Party style terms, post-50 terms, which were radically, were about radical democracy, both economic and political. How do you build a massive organization? Spain is quite a big country with very different political realities in one place and another, almost separate at some points. How you build that? That was like the question Podemos had to face in its first Constituent Assembly, which was in the autumn 2014 in Vista Alegre. There you have a picture of the second Vista Alegre, which I will go back in a moment, which was in February. But there was a first one. Vista Alegre is just a big sports pavilion in Madrid, in which people from all over the country flocked in and decided about what model Podemos was going to have.
So this was a couple of months after the European elections?
This was a bit later. This was after the summer. It was at the end of October 2014. There was an event in the middle of this that has to be kept in mind, and is that Podemos at some point was topping the opinion polls.
Was? Sorry?
Topping like the electoral polls, right? But at some other point, another party sprang, which is called Ciudadanos, which stemming from a more, let's say, liberal, non-related to 15M point of view, but in a way, it was like all this malaise, all this sort of social unrest. Some of it was channeled towards Ciudadanos, right? So at that moment, Podemos started sort of very slowly, started declining in the polls, but at some point Podemos was just leading the polls. If elections, according to the polls, were held in I think it was July, June 2014, Podemos will win. We win the general elections. This was complete madness, you can figure.
General election was a complete...
General election was afterwards, okay. But I'm talking about the opinion polls, right? Many of the core founders of Podemos are political scientists. They do look at the polls very closely. And this, in what created in Vista Alegre was what it was called the electoral war machine, right? Which was, in a way, and this classic, I mean, this, it's a point which we criticize with the criticals. We criticize at that moment, but now everyone agrees on. This was the substitute for building up an organization that would stand up to the challenge that the circles have put on the table, right? It's like, let's not solve the problem of organization as such, but let's focus on the elections, and the rest will come, right? And this created a model a bit too vertical, a bit too, let's say, at some points plebiscitarian, where questions were asked on the internet with just no basis. And this also openly relegated the circus to the role of mere, like a poster fixing on the walls in the election. And of course, this, even though the circus remained pretty strong at some places, but of course, when people approach politics in such enthusiasm, this was a bit of a downer. It's like, all right, calm down. We are going to do politics for you again, right? And this sort of, even though the circles, depending on the places, on the neighborhoods, remained strong, others were completely out of the picture, but it sort of stopped the process of, like growing. Yeah? So, local elections were afterwards. So this is some things that have happened in Spain have got a lot of, a contingent side to it. Like The Spanish electoral calendar was European, local, national elections, right? This has, in the way we have this sort of ecosystem, political ecosystem goes born in 15M. These sort of contingent facts are very important, right?
The timeline that you
The
had
timeline, yeah.
because you first campaigned in the for the European parliamentary elections. Then you decided not to directly run for the local elections, but to run for the national parliament. So it was like a calendar, and at each juncture, you had to decide what would be your strategy, what would be your positioning vis-à-vis these elections, and what would be the criteria or the circumstances in order to pick your electoral battles.
Yeah, and in the case of the regional and local elections, those were the elections where I myself became involved in Podemos. You have to keep in mind that at that point, even though Podemos was top of the polls for intention of vote, very few people were actually taking decisions in the organization, right? So going to local election and regional elections forces a new organization to actually go local.
It forces.
Spain, I insist, is quite a large country, many cities, many different regional differences, and this sort of implies that you have to build up like the local organization on the local level. Who is going to be there? How are things going to be shaped on the local level? The regional level was always clear that Podemos will go into it. It's 17 autonomous communities. A whole organizational model was set up on Vista Alegre 1, setting up citizen countries in all the autonomous communities. But the cities are so many.
And the
so
different landscapes.
So different, like trying to control from Podemos such a process so soon was just impossible.
Yeah.
So what happened there is that many other actors, we took the initiative of going for local candidatures in the local elections.
And they were supported by Podemos.
This was quite a process, but at the end they were supported by Podemos. You know, they were developed to such extent at some point that it was, I mean, we asked, I remember at that point, I wasn't in Podemos, I entered Podemos at that stage as a part of that process of coming together with other actors, social movements, the classical left of the more distant parts of the classical left that were moving towards that, those sort of coalitions. And at some point it was said, okay, we are going to a local election to Podemos. Do you want to take part of this or not? And at the end it was yes.
So people responded
exactly.
positively to this.
But it's not Podemos. I will have to go city by city to say how is the structure, which I'm not going to do. But just to make clear that on a local level, Podemos is an actor among others, whereas in a state level, Podemos is the actor with others that support from, the regions, Catalonia, Galicia, from different, sort of slightly different variations of Podemos, but still Podemos is like the big trademark, whereas the local is different.
So we can fairly assume here that, because on both cases, and even if we started with the European, then we had the national parliament and you had the local elections. In the three different scenarios, you kept a considerable, steady amount of votes, right? Yeah. But at the same time, and this is, I think it's interesting for all of us, the voters in this new political experience cannot be described as loyal, permanent, steady, as opposing to the traditional political parties.
Yeah,
and I imagine that over 2-3 years, it was not easy to do so many achievements in order to count on your, and these supporters would become like permanent supporters. So how did you manage this how did you manage to keep this capital and to prove yourself once more that you are capable, and it is possible, since you decided to run for the second and the third electoral battle?
The thing is, new parties bringing out in these new political conjunctures after the crisis all over the world have got the same sort of approach to their voters, which is, or relation to their voters, which is completely different from the old parties. Completely different. In which sense? I always make the comparison with all communist parties, right? Euro-communist parties, right? These feed on a very strong identity. I am communist. And no matter what happens, I'm always going to vote communist. Socialist parties, or social democratic parties in many parts of Europe, in many parts of the world, work that very same way. I belong to this party, I belong to the trade union, these are votes that are always there.
It's part of the identity, of course.
It's part of the identity, or in worst cases, they are part of clientelar networks as well. But the identity plays a role there, which is fairly important. This won't happen to new parties at all. Elections are, for us, mobilization processes, are means to create more movement around the political idea.
But in your case, we can understand maybe that it was sufficient that you kept your word by saying, we're going to be an active on the political scene, we're going to run for these elections, we're going to continue this path.
But there is, if we want to understand at what point we are right now, something has to be kept in mind. There have been 2 general elections in the last year in Spain. The first one gave a hung parliament, and elections were repeated, right?
Okay.
Ones were in June, and the other ones were in December. Or December and June. No, well, the first one was in December 2015, and then June 2016, right? From one election to the other, Podemos lost 1 million votes.
1 million?
1 million votes, right? So many debates have been held on why Podemos lost 1 million votes, right? Would there be here someone else who would tell you another different interpretation? Well, or many, so on my side of things, how we see things, is that that campaign, that election, precisely was counting on the previous capital as a base, okay. As a floor. So it kept very toned down, very sort of quiet, calm. Let's not make so much. Let's not make the establishment have too much fear of us.
So we have
because
to keep
this can be, we can scare the middle classes, and the middle classes will run away from us if we are too scary. And at the end, what we have was 1 million less votes.
So right? You assume that the first million, these million voters, because they voted for you in the beginning, mm-hmm. So by keeping, the positive, cool strategy, they're going to do it again. But
the thing is, would it be here someone else would tell you we effectively scare the middle classes? I don't think that. I think we are in many, many places, and new parties are a reflection of something very hard for new parties to deal with, which is a crisis of representation. You don't represent me. Only in exceptional conditions, you represent me. But this is something temporal, which doesn't have a strong sort of affiliation to it, right? That's where identity and the old parties and the comparison comes in. For a start, I don't believe in politicians, right? I will believe in you for a moment, but if you let me down, I will flow somewhere else. Or I will vote you for the mieux, mm-hmm. right? Which is another version of this crisis of representation. Mm-hmm. Okay, we have been voting the Socialist Party and the old Communist Party, Izquierda Unida, with that reasoning for the mieux. I mean, the rest doesn't suit us, so let's vote for this, even though we know it's awful. It's awful, and they are going to make the same policies, and the system is going to be being the same. It will have been with the others, right? So I don't know if I make myself clear. Like,
I think it's
so
clear enough. Everyone is identifying him or herself at some point, so it's fine. I think I'm gonna skip the other questions. I'm gonna allow myself to ask one last more question and then open the floor to your thoughts, to your comments. But maybe by these points we can also have other people intervening. But this is very specific to really ask you about the lessons learned from your experience on a personal level, but also the experience being part of building up this institution. So we were thinking, we had three main concerns. So the first one is, because you've said that you've opened the membership for Podemos to hundreds and thousands of members, right? So it's not only about the 20 or the 100 or the 1,000 that were core within this movement. So the question here would be, what were the mechanisms, or how did you manage to keep this synergy inside the organization while opening up to all these people who were voters and supporters, and that in order to make them feel that they are part of this process and part of the decision making? On another level, and this is more, it's more related to the internal dynamics. How did you manage to create this political leadership, and what were these accountability mechanisms without really going back to the traditional classical, model of leadership that is very vertical, very centralized? And on the third level, and this is, I think, it's very useful for all of us to hear your thoughts around this issue. How did you manage within these internal dynamic to shift or to have these meaningful, real political debates in order, to grow this movement and to finish this phase from something that is circumstantial, in very, very specific, to become a real institution? So if you can, give us your thoughts on these three issues, and maybe we can open the floor to everyone's questions.
So let me start by the end.
Okay. But brief, we need to finish at 6:30, so we can have at least half an hour of discussion.
Yeah, sure. Yes, but it's an important question. It's just to go in, like keeping up the scale of the reasoning. We in Podemos, mostly all over, between the first general election and until the second Vista Alegre, which you have a picture there, there was a growing, fractional dispute, fractional struggle, divisions, very strong internal divisions, which were related to many things, which were related to, a very fast bureaucratization of the party, many new jobs related to the party being held, and paid jobs being dependent on the party, who controls these people, who control those jobs. So mini clientelar networks developing in the country. It was a very nasty situation. And of course there were political differences. But let's say, to put it very fastly and very brutally, the thing is, internal processes, and this is one of the strong points of Podemos. Podemos and the whole culture it has, political culture it has carried with. This happens in Ahora Madrid, this happens in Barcelona and Comú, it happens everywhere. We have primaries.
Primaries inside.
Primaries inside the organization, in which we vote for documents, in which we vote for lists, right? Documents, political documents, ethical documents, organizational documents. What does this mean? How these fractional struggles have totally apace, have calmed down because of coming to public light instead of denying them. We are let's say, the new parties or the new political organizations. We are always going to be heterogeneous, always going to be plural, you know? But let's make this difference work as political debate. Let's give light to those differences instead of trying to hide them. Because once you go public on those divisions, of course, those who only have personal ambitions are forced to create a political discourse. I mean, it's all right. There are ambitions on the table. What for? What do you want power for? What are you going to do with it? No? This creates political debate instead of personal ambitions. Or also, you know, not only personal ambitions or power ambitions, but just, you know, meaningful political debates that go into an internal process, that go into a legitimate way of solving this process, which are the primaries, and there is a consensus on this method of decision. So there are primaries, there are votes, there are new organs which respect more or less proportionality of the different sensibilities of the organization.
Let's be clear, it's about vote. Hundreds and thousands of people participated in this these elections. It's not only about the couple of hundreds that
we're
directly.
Talking, the census in Podemos is 300,000 people.
Exactly, and it's about exposing these internal debates to this public. And what's interesting is that it's not only voting for people who are running for office, it's also voting for, as you said, ethical documents and political documents, and so it was, programs.
Documents are voted before people. So you can have a situation in which a set of people are elected and have to conform to other people's documents.
So other people's program.
Exactly.
So
exactly. Let's say ideas before people, which I think is quite a decent ideal. Sorry? That's the census. In the last primaries, it was pretty high. It wasn't the 300,000 that voted, but it was almost 80% of the census that voted. Primaries are also mobilization processes. The Socialist Party, which was about to explode and disappear in Spain, has recently held primaries, and their affiliation has gone 60% when they were dying, because this sort of creates the political debate, creates the interest in politics in a moment where, as I tell you, the normal situation is that of representation crisis. I don't believe politicians, I don't care about politics, right? So other lessons that we have learned on a more institutional level, right? I think the main lesson, and I think here, with maybe a bit of difference on the different sensibilities of Podemos, but everyone will agree with me that Vista Alegre one was a mistake, was a huge mistake to make such a political party. In which respect, what does an electoral machine once the elections are over? What do? You find a very large bunch of people into regional parliaments, into national parliament. What do? So institutions are very powerful, very, very powerful state institutions such as parliaments. They have a way of working which, by its own logic, just shapes the way you look at politics. If you come from other spheres of politics, such as social movements, you immediately see it. They put you to work in their own terms, right? And this means you can get cut out from the people so easily. So easily. Mm-hmm. Of course, Podemos made such a bold move going for the electoral process, right? But there wasn't, no one ever theoretically or practically reflected on what the state is, on what power of the state is. Does it lie all in parliaments? There are parts of the state power which is not in parliament. Which are parliaments? You know, how do they work? You know, all these kind of things we have been learning them on the
process.
On the process.
We're learning.
You know, we are learning. And what I think is the main point is that we need not only the organization in the institution, but we need very strong movements behind that, social movements in general, I would say, rather than social movement, behind social support outside of the institution, because these are not, let's say that these institutions are not shaped to work for our interests.
So
you know, in order to have the strength, you know, to go for the challenge we have, that we need a movement that goes and says to elected representatives, this is the way.
Yeah. So you need 15M actually to accompany your path and your
15M,
or groups similar or initiatives similar to
15M. 15M is dead. I mean, we talk like that a bit like the hippies talk about Woodstock. It's like, oh, it was so beautiful, and it's gone. And something on the same terms. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I think this is one of the questions that hopefully will emerge. Is what would be the opportunities and the challenges once you are in the system, not outside the system anymore, and how you can work with these social movements that are extremely crucial for these new political groups to survive.
I would say this in very sort of classical terms: the strategy and tactics, the long term and the medium term and the short term decisions. There are, when people, you know, there's always like this sort of derogatory statement about, you know, let's say direct democracy, about people cannot be doing politics all the time, you know. Of course, this refers to the tactics. There has to be a core of people which is taking tactical decisions in parliaments or outside parliaments. But we're talking here about the strategy. Where are we going? What do we want? What are our goals? These have to be set outside of the organization, or by the basis of the organization. Call it what you want, but they cannot be made in parliaments, because we certainly go wrong.
Okay, on that note, thank you very, very, very much. Maybe you can have some water, because you're going to be bombarded with questions. So we're going to start. في مايك. ايه مين وارف كلها عيطة. لا مبلا أنا بخاف منك.
بس بدك ببلش حدا تاني. Okay. Thank you first. Okay. So 15M created this gap where all the people said no for all the old political parties, and there were new movements started, and Podemos came after. So some kind of a taboo people created about new movements like Podemos to interact with all political parties. But I don't believe that all people in the old political parties are bad and they want corruption and etc. So now that you are in the institutions, how do you interact with good people if they exist in the old political parties? No. They don't need any help. No allies. They don't need. You don't need any allies from the old political parties.
Should we take several ones?
Yeah, I'm gonna take several, because maybe some questions will. So here the question is, how do you strategize about, you know, not building alliances with other political parties? So this is one question. أنا هاخد note. مين في بعد؟ sorry. لكن منى أنت بتشوفي
Okay, I have two very short questions, I hope. The first one, I know you spoke about how is it that you tried to surpass some sort of traditional leadership through creating plurality inside the party. But I was wondering, because of this picture, how much is it that the face of, I think, Pablo Iglesias created in creating a sense of mobilization of people around him? So how, I mean, I know in that sense, how important is it that you have some form of charismatic leadership as opposed to the plural form of leadership that you took on, and how that helped you throughout the election? Because when I was first introduced to Podemos, it was through that face, when I was first attracted to it. Another question is about how you collect supporters that lie outside of your, not professionals, not activists, people that lie outside of what you, the supporters that you wouldn't expect would follow you, but are central to the movement, who would constitute the movement behind the party. So, and these supporters, I mean, now I'm just thinking about it, I'm comparing it to the Lebanese context, because I'm thinking, how is it that you can rally those that know that those institutions don't work in their favor and that don't like these politicians or those bankers or whoever, but at the same time depend on those same institutions that reproduce the kind of identities that they live by, either sectarian or whatsoever. So how is it that you can grab that kind of people, not by depending on spontaneous events like 15M? So how do you surpass the spontaneity of these events and put agency into them? Yeah, that's it.
في حد في سؤال هون؟ مايك وبعدين اي في هون قدام وفي هون. So 5 questions and then we answer.
Thank you for the presentation. You mentioned that many of your documents were voted, in fact, by the militants. One question about that. Were there some important political differences among the people who voted? And if there were, did some people leave the movement when their ideas did not pass? This is one point. And then now you describe the process as very, let's say, decentralized and democratic, but I know that in Podemos you have really like a central decision maker who's very strong.
I said it as well.
Yeah,
Huh?
yeah, okay. Okay, and one last point is, because traditional parties connect with their constituencies in different regions through established bases, local, like sometimes it's a place, a physical place. I think you don't have this, and you don't even have the means to maintain those things. So how do you do to maintain this relationship with your constituencies all over the country?
So one last question, and maybe you answer this one question, and then we go for a second round.
Okay. Isidro, the purpose of my question is to see if you, in your experience, lived and overcame some of the problems that we suffer from in this country. Issue number 1 is really religious, because there are so many sectarian divisions upon religious basis. The second one is ethical, because our relationship to the politician and his relationship to the individual is called a client system. He doesn't look at me as a voter, he sees in me a potential client. Am I going to get paid, and what is he going to pay me? And the third one is medical, which is because of the significant wars that we lived in and traumatized us over so many years. We have become a conflictive brain. Not being, we have a high percentage of an anxiety disorder called post-traumatic stress disorder, which causes a conflictive brain, and we have no confidence amongst us. So these are 3 major issues that prevent the Lebanese from overcoming their difficulties. Have you lived through any of those? And if you did, how did you overcome them? Thank you.
Okay, so you have the questions.
So,
حنجاوب على هول هلا وبنرجع بدك شو؟ نجاوب على هول ناخذ second round. Sorry.
how do we relate to all parties? Has this relation changed with being in the institution? It has changed in the regard for persons, I mean, which form part of other parties, and you have obviously a relation with in sort of face-to-face terms. I don't think, which before you didn't have, of course. So in regarding persons and regarding sometimes something that is important, understanding not only your own internal conflicts, but other parties' internal conflicts and different positions, being in the institutions is pretty useful, right? For example, the Popular Party seemed to us like a complete sort of close, solid machinery. And when you see it from near, you see that that's not the case at all. They have their own way of sorting their problems, which is different from ours. And insofar as control of the state apparatus is involved, sometimes implies sending people to jail as a part of an internal conflict, which we don't do, right? But they, you know, like we have like a more finely ingrained vision of traditional parties once you look at them from near instead of from television. Regarding alliances, of course, and here there are several sensibilities within Podemos. There are two main issues, or one issue, in fact. Which kind of a relation do we have with the all left political organizations? There is the Socialist Party in Spain, there is the Communist Party in Spain, right? And there are two or three different positions in what relation should we have with the all organizations. You know, one side of Podemos is more keen, and has been the case, in order to have a coalition. In the last elections, it wasn't Podemos that went to elections, it was Unidos Podemos, because this include Izquierda Unida, which was the all Communist Party, which has come to this coalition. It's got a different parliamentary group, but goes together in the election. This happens as well, and has to be kept in mind, with the Catalan group, En Comú Podem, and Marea, which is the Galician part of the Podemos is four different parliamentary groups, right? One of them is the All Communist Party, which nowadays has made a bit of a split between those, say, younger generations that feel more near to Podemos, and the All Communist Guard, which has been, you know, they have most of them left by their own foot, right? So this opens the question: what happens to the Socialist Party? There is a part of Podemos which is keener on arriving to very fast sort of government agreements with the Socialist Party, and the other one is more cautious about that. You know, it depends also on the position each sensibility has got towards government. We want government at any cost. Do we want government in certain conditions? You know, to give you a sense of the debates. But, for example, the government in Madrid City, which is held by Ahora Madrid, is due to a coalition of the votes of the Socialist Party, which is, of course, there wasn't a doubt about this coalition, because the number of votes of Ahora Madrid was far so bigger than the Socialist Party, that the Socialist Party was going to be in a subordinate position. I don't know if I make myself clear, you know? Of course, if you get double of the votes, of course, there is a leading force and a smaller force. Would we have liked to do otherwise, on the other sense, support the PSOE government with the votes of Ahora Madrid? That would be much more conflictive, you know? So I don't know if this gives you a sense of the situation.
But the second round, but the question about leadership, I think.
Leadership.
Questions
There have been many, let's say, critical points towards the hyper leadership of charismatic leadership of Pablo Iglesias, and there are still today quite a few. I have been myself very critical of the prominent role as a sort of a charismatic leader of Pablo Iglesias, but let's say a compromise has been arrived to, you know, in terms of how much of a leader, how much of a, you know, after, you know, like after all this Vista Alegre one, which was obviously, you know, the figure of Pablo Iglesias like overarching the organizations, almost as a sort of a party on its own. Up to today, many compromises have been held on that side. You know, it has been very nuanced, right? We don't think we can talk about hyper leadership in the same way we did in the first days when everything seemed to accumulate on Pablo Iglesias, because also, because of the logical of media, of exposition, there is a declining curve in charisma, right? There's no way you can keep an organization solely on leadership, because media and exposition is very aggressive and erodes leadership quite fast these days. So several compromises have been made there, and now I would say we have a more sort of balanced situation than the one it was at the beginning, where the figure of Pablo Iglesias was so prominent.
We had Mark's question on if people,
how to gain support outside the party.
Yes, how to maintain this support from the voters, knowing that the country is extremely wide, and how do you keep this relationship going?
There is a problem. This is not a solved question.
It's not solved, Mark.
This is not. No, because in a way, of course, for many people, the way you relate to them is basically the media, right? Once the decision was taken that the circles were going to be sort of marginal part of the party tactics and of the party structures, of course, it's the media you refer to. So we don't have a feedback from the media, from the people, unless that's why that's the problem of not building up a bottom clearly, of not having a clear bet for bottom-up organizations, is that you lack information about your own people. Because of course, you have people in the circles which are always there and give you your opinion, but there are many, many more people who will count themselves as voters, which have no way of expressing their views or debating their views, of meaning or transforming the views into meaningful political lines. And those are the problems of relying too much on media. Media will give you back the image media have of themselves, but not the people that, I don't know if I make clear myself. The center, like the center spectrum of politics is collapsing everywhere in the world. But if you watch media, you won't notice. And you get to elections, and you get Theresa May saying that he's going to destroy human rights, and you get Jeremy Corbyn saying that he's going to nationalize half of the country's industry. But if you watch the media, it's not there. Right, so just relying on the media will give you a distorted image of the actual real political constitution of the country.
Okay. The first question regarding the voting. For example, if they voted a program that is not
many people left. Podemos. Some people did in very, very sort of personal circumstances, but there hasn't been. Podemos has managed, or we all have managed, because this is a collective success, to keep rather different political positions together without splitting. I believe internal processes are key to this, because it sort of gives, and proportionality in the composition of organs is basic to this, So even if organs will get difficult to manage, as opposed to a one-side, one-color, one-line political organ, if you get like a plural organ, it's always more difficult to manage, but at least it's more legitimate, right? And thanks to that, not many people have left Podemos, and definitely no one in an organized way. Like we, who held this position, who is far more to the left.
Massive resignation. It was really
right. Let's say, imagine. I take part in the anti-capitalist sector. Like we say, well, okay, the anti-capitalists will flee Podemos. No, haven't even been in question. Even though political differences exist and are going to exist still for a long time, and let's hope they exist, because correctly focused, this is a source of strength and not of weaknesses.
We have the multi-layered question.
All right.
Here,
We have
before doing the second round.
no,
It's fundamental, of course.
I mean, it's important. Just sorry, I know so little about Lebanon, but I cannot make the comparison in a proper way. But let's say we have our own set of historically defined
Traumas.
issues that most of them spring from our civil war, 1936 to 1939, our 40 years of dictatorship, our transition. We have our own set of classical, historical, political issues. One of them is the church and its relation to the state. The other one is monarchy or a republic. And the other ones are nationalisms. You know, those are the three main points that compose, let's say, the classical historical picture in Spain. Some of them we have completely neglected. We have sort of avoided giving an answer to them because we think they split the debate in the wrong way. I mean, if we start talking monarchy or republic, instead of talking about the levels of the material levels of welfare of the people, we are trapped in the wrong debate. We are trapped in the wrong cleavages. We are trapped in the wrong right-left axis, which is already pre-existent to us. I don't know. We want to talk about how to build a proper healthcare system which cannot be privatized. Let's not start by talking monarchy or republic. Let's not start by discussing the church and the state and its relations. No, let's start by discussing what we really want. Let's put the things we want first. So this has been our strategic approach on that one, and I believe it's completely right. Had we, for example, one of the differences between us and the Communist Party is that the Communist Party wants to say, we want to be a republic, we don't want to be a monarchy. But for us, this is not the debate now.
It's not the concern, because it came up when we was
It's not that it's not important. It's just that it's such an overcooked debate. Mm-hmm. We cannot move into those spheres. Doesn't mean it's not important. We were asking at the beginning for a constituent process, right? Let's rethink the whole social order again. Of course, once you put the constituent process on the going, you are going to discuss a republic or a monarchy, but let's not focus on the pre-existent debates. It's not that they are not important. It's that we have another set of questions which are important, which are other battles. Doesn't mean it's not important. Of course, there is just one exception, which is nationalism, particularly on the Catalan side, which has been so prominent on the last years that it was no way. And of course, it has to do also with how the Spanish state is built. It's not just only about the Catalan nationalism or the Basque nationalism. It is that in Spain, every region has got its own political settings, and Podemos has always accused of being too much of a Madrid thing, of Madrid views and even Jacobin things. So at some point in Spain, the territorial structure has to be thought of. There's no way we can escape that one. And it is important.
You had these strategic decisions that whatever previous political cleavages, if they don't fall within your, political program,
yeah, that's clear.
Let's put them aside and let's work.
Yeah, there was another important point there, and it's clientelistic networks and corruption. We've had an enormous problem of corruption cases in Spain in the last years. Following the crisis, what seemed to be like well-ingrained machines started appearing by judiciary processes as corrupt networks. In Madrid, it's one of the worst cases of full-on corruption by the Popular Party. This is extremely important. Breaking this is very important for us, but also, in a way, saying that this is no of course, the people that have been involved in this sort of clientelistic, corrupt networks have to go to jail. They have to go to judiciary processes. But what we want to impeach is not just the people, it's the model that has created the possibility of so many people to be corrupt. It's not because the dangers of corruption being at the center stage of politics is just the change of face. Okay, all right, this one was corrupt, the bad apple, let's put it away. Well, let's have another one. No. We're talking the system that has made so many cases possible. And of course, those who have been found guilty of being in corruption networks, they have to go to jail personally themselves, not someone behind them. They have to be in jail and stay there for 20 or 30 years.
Second round of questions, we're going to have 3 questions. Ooh. 1 2 3 4 5. Okay, we stay. No, we stay.
Okay, my question just a little bit off the topic.
Where are you? Can I see you? Ah, okay.
I'm going to ask my question. It's a little bit off the topic, but can you shed some light about Catalonia? Why are they so adamant about exiting Spain? Is it going to be a viable, no, just briefly, just because you're the expert, is it going to be a viable state if it does?
I'll need another talk.
And has your movement, has it polarized the Catalonians either way now that it has emerged? I mean, is it going to change their mind?
No, it's just a huge topic.
No, okay.
So you have talked a lot about Podemos, but and kind of avoided a bit the local level. I understand that it's very complex, but probably it's more relevant to the Beirut Madinati experience, and it has answered in different ways different questions that Podemos has dealt with, like the disconnection from the people. So if you can touch a bit on your experience on the differences on strategies and tactics of the municipal, very successful movement, that would be great.
You have 20% Podemos of the national parliament, and obviously you have been able to change the discourse, the priorities, and the vision of policies. But were you able to legislate, to pass legislations with only 20%? Were you able to go into alliances on specific legislations? That's my first question. My second question, it is often believed that people don't vote based on personal interest, but on group interest or identity. Like for instance, in the US, you have working people voting for the Republicans and very wealthy people like Warren Buffett voting for the Democrats. So were you able to work yourself? Did you have an idea or concept of working on identity for people to identify with a group identity and vote for Podemos as an identity, or more on like personal interest of working and middle class people?
Okay. So
We have a question, maybe here, yeah. Last question, and maybe, oh no, sorry, 2 questions. Hey. Oh, wow.
wow.
Can you answer in 3 minutes and 30 seconds, the 3 questions?
Thank you very much, Isidro. I think it's been a wonderful lecture. A very simple question. Can you please talk a little bit more about the role that technology is playing in the articulating the structure of Podemos? Beyond, that I think that there is some institutionalization of trolls on the part of the political party in the sense of publicity, outreach to people who are not a Podemos. But I'm interested in the how technology is playing out in the organization of the party. You mentioned before about the plebiscitarian questions that were asked. I don't know if that system is still in place or not. Thank you.
Okay. Hay por ahí una...
No, just I think we have in Spain and Lebanon some core that it's related. Here the Taif agreements, and you talk about monarchy. How can you say that it's not important? We have
I didn't
a monarch.
say that. I didn't say that.
That is not. But it's our king was elected by the dictatorship after a coup that. So how this is like a corset that is involving all the political goals that you pretend to reach?
Yes, I'll start by the last one because it's simple. I didn't say it's not important.
I said the country.
I said
It's not on the agenda.
I said let's not start talking about this. I didn't say it's not important. It's of course, it's the whole political order. It's how it's shaped. We have to talk about that. But how we approach that moment is a difference in tactics, right? And we prefer to go to the new themes. Doesn't mean this is not important. It is important. Going for identity. Should we go for identity or just for, let's say, personal interest? I think identity on parties is quite difficult to create on the current conditions. There is in the current social conditions in most of the world, it is very difficult to get an identity related to a political party. You know, our societies are so fragmented with so many different political positions that it's very difficult to have saying like I am a liberal from the Liberal Party, I am a socialist from the Socialist, but this I don't think is going to happen in quite a few years. I wouldn't say going for personal interests, but rather how those different heterogeneous positions go into a common program, to a common political program, which is not just interest. It's a way of building up between all that we have to build up, and this is our aim. In this sort of completely kaleidoscopic societies, how do we get together politically? How the interest of women, of migrants, of precarious workers, of autonomous and small entrepreneurs, our working class people, how are we going to weave together in order to challenge the current regime? That's and the political program, and say a fair consensus on what the political program means is the main piece. The main piece there. Have we been able to pass on legislation? We have in the Madrid Parliament influenced some legislation. Of course, we are minorities, so not much, but some things have been done, and some things even minor. I mean, I cannot go into the account, but some minor victories are on the table. Of course, being minority. It's not actual policies, and that was one of the debates after the electoral war machine. It's like, okay, we are not in power. What are we going to do? We cannot massively influence policies on a completely new basis, right? But some things have been. Oh yeah, of course. In parliaments, in order to concrete votes have to be made with alliances. Oh yeah, of course, but that's part of parliamentary life. Yeah, I mean, for example, one of our main small victories was a raising on the minimal rents for people that have nothing in Madrid. For doing that, we have to do it with the Socialist Party and with Ciudadanos in order to raise those. But that's the dynamics of parliamentary. You need enough votes to get some things done. I mean, if you don't want to do that, I mean, unless you just want to go to Parliament and like Sinn Féin, so leave the empty seats, which is another option. But if you're going to be there, you're going to have to do this.
So we only have 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Questions.
5 minutes for Catalonia.
Local and.
I have technologies for technology and Catalonia in 5 minutes. Oh my God.
I told you 2 hours were not.
I'll try to give. Well, technology is very prominent insofar as, for example, we don't have militants. We have subscribers to the web page that have voted in internal processes. Those 300,000 are not militants in the old sense of the word. They don't carry a card saying, I am a Podemos militant, I pay some money a month to Podemos. It's people that have been part of participatory processes of different kind in the web page. activism on the social networks is vital. It's going on all the time. Twitter, basically. Some Facebook, but Twitter basically as a tool. So those two I will cover, and that's an inheritance of 15M as well, like what we call technopolitics. And that I think is well covered. There is also the vast question about the census, keeping the census, who's going to vote in elections, that really I don't feel, I haven't got the knowledge to answer you about those sort of things. We need one of the, IT persons to come here and explain how they do it, but I can say it's very important. And then for Catalonia.
We have the question of
Ahora Madrid, oh my God. Well, there are some on this like narrative I have made about Podemos. Of course, there were the local experience which have done things a bit different. I won't talk so much about Ahora Madrid or Barcelona en Común, where I think the real experimentation is taking place is in smaller cities. By smaller, I am saying 200,000, 300,000 cities like Zaragoza, the Galician cities, or Cádiz. There has been a much closer presence of movements into the decisions made inside the institution. All those cities are governed by municipalist candidatures, right? In which some of them Podemos is, and in others it's not. In Galicia, for example, Podemos is not part of them. But they are part of the same cycle, same ecosystem. And of course, being in a medium-sized city, there are some strategies that are easier to implement, like such as before having an extremely important decision for the local government, having a general assembly, a presidential general assembly, deliberative, in which decisions and consensus are taken. This is the case, for example, of Galician cities. Catalonia. Just very quickly. In 2012, there's been an unrest in Catalonia with their embeddedness in the Spanish state for very long. Before the crisis, there was quite a bit of unrest regarding what we call the Estatuto de Autonomía, the terms of the autonomous region, right? But it all developed in the years of the crisis. Catalonia faced one of the most virulent crises in the whole of Europe in economical terms, right? Cuts and privatization were huge there, huge. And this created social unrest, right? And it was, in a way, there was, if someone from the independentist side was here, could possibly challenge me for hours. But the, let's say, forward move of the government in Catalonia, the right-wing government in Catalonia, was to adopt independentism. Of course, there was a mass of people who already wanted that, who already thought part of the crisis was due to the presence in Spain. But also, and very important, there was a move by the very same people that were actually implementing the cuts in order to go independentist. Independentist to a certain extent. This is what we call, in Catalonia, it's called the process, el procés. And this is never ending. You know? It's not so much about independence, but the hope of independence, right? Which keeps things going, you know? And on the other hand, on the other side, it's always a negotiation with Madrid. You know, territorial tensions in Spain have always worked like that. You know, at least from the side of the say conservative nationalism, it's like I threaten independence in order to get advantages. You know, in the Basque Country, the whole fiscal system is different from the rest of the country because it was the threat of independence that shaped things like that. it will be like the other one. It will be forbidden by the Constitutional Tribunal. The promoters will be labeled as victims. Always the same.
Thank you, Isidro. Really, it was fascinating. شكرا جميعا. دنيا أكيد شكرا.
Social justice, and especially Rana Hassan. I don't know how I forgot this in the beginning. Thank you for linking us through to Isidro, suggesting his name, and making this possible. Thank you both. This was great. To me, tons of lessons learned and a very inspirational talk. Thank you. Thank you all for your patience. I'm sorry we kept you late.